At the moment, the system dashboard turned red during a live board meeting. Charlotte Hayes realized every replacement she approved had already begun collapsing in silence without warning and without mercy. Welcome to Poor Girl's Destiny channel, wishing you a joyful day, filled with happiness and peace. Thank you for being here. Now let us begin this story together and follow every moment closely. Charlotte Hayes stood at the head of the glass conference table inside the top floor of Hayes Global Technologies, her expression controlled but sharp as dozens of screens around the room displayed real-time operational data flowing across departments like a living nervous system for the company. Beside her sat senior executives watching as the female CEO tapped her finger once against the polished surface and spoke with absolute confidence. Ethan Walker is no longer part of our operational structure. Effective immediately, we will transition all responsibilities to the external consulting team. The room remained quiet for a moment, not because they disagreed, but because they were processing the scale of what she had just removed. Ethan Walker had never been loud. He never argued in meetings, never interrupted decisions, and never attempted to elevate himself beyond his assigned role. But within Hayes Global Technologies, he was the unseen stabilizer of multiple interconnected systems, the kind of person whose presence was only noticed in silence when nothing broke. Charlotte believed that silence meant replaceability. She believed expertise could be purchased, assembled, and optimized like machinery, and that dependency on one individual was a structural weakness. She intended to correct that weakness. Immediately, the consulting team arrived. Within hours, a group of highly credentialed professionals carrying laptops, tablets, and presentation boards filled with diagrams and optimization models. They spoke with confidence about restructuring workflows, improving efficiency, and eliminating bottlenecks. Charlotte listened approvingly as they described Ethan's role as overly centralized and outdated. The transition began before the day ended. Systems were reassigned, permissions redistributed, and new protocols were implemented across departments. At first, everything appeared improved. Dashboards looked cleaner, reports generated faster, and communication layers became more complex. But within hours, subtle inconsistencies began to appear. Minor delays in synchronization across internal tools, reports that failed to align across departments, and small gaps in data updates that no one could immediately explain. Charlotte dismissed them as adjustment noise, expecting stabilization within the next cycle. But by the next morning, the noise had grown louder. Critical communication pathways between regional offices began lagging. Financial dashboards stopped updating in real time, and internal scheduling systems began duplicating entries, causing confusion across multiple departments. The consulting team assured her it was temporary friction cost. By integration, she accepted their explanation publicly, but privately her focus sharpened as she reviewed system logs. Ethan Walker's name no longer appeared anywhere in the architecture, but traces of his prior structural logic still existed, embedded in layers no one had yet replaced. One of the senior engineers hesitated before approaching Charlotte, with a report suggesting that Ethan's original framework had been acting as a silent coordination layer between systems that no one had documented properly. Charlotte frowned at the term silent coordination layer and responded firmly, then rebuild it without him. That should not be necessary. But as the day progressed, the system instability escalated beyond minor errors. Entire communication chains began failing simultaneously, and departments that once functioned seamlessly began operating in isolation. Confusion spread across executive channels, and meetings were called urgently as leadership attempted to identify the root cause. It was during one of these emergency sessions that Charlotte first felt uncertainty, as multiple experts in the room admitted that their systems depended on an underlying structure they did not fully understand. Ethan Walker had not simply been an employee, he had been the invisible architecture holding everything together. And as Charlotte looked again at the cascading alerts across the screens, she realized for the first time that removing a person was not the same as removing their influence, and the system she believed she had improved was now beginning to reveal how deeply it had always depended on the man she had chosen to replace. Charlotte Hayes remained standing at the glass conference table long after the initial wave of alerts had begun spreading across the company's systems like cracks forming beneath polished surface. Confidence. The consulting team continued presenting their optimization plans, but their voices now felt less certain as new data inconsistencies appeared in real time across multiple screens. Charlotte's expression tightened as she watched regional dashboards begin to desynchronize one after another, each failure small on its own, but forming a pattern too structured to ignore. She turned toward the lead consultant and asked in a controlled voice, "Explain why our East Coast systems are now operating without synchronization." The consultant adjusted his glasses, quickly attempting to maintain composure as he responded, "This appears to be a cascade delay caused by incomplete integration layers from the previous architecture. We are compensating for it." Charlotte's eyes narrowed slightly. "Previous architecture," she repeated firmly, referring to Ethan Walker's framework. "Yes," the consultant admitted reluctantly. "The system he designed appears to have functioned as a hidden coordination layer, but we assumed it was redundant." Charlotte did not respond immediately. Her gaze shifted back to the monitors, where multiple alerts were now flashing across departments that had never previously experienced communication failure. In parallel across the room, executives began exchanging uneasy looks as confidence in the transition strategy began to erode. Charlotte raised her hand, signaling for silence, and said, "We were told this system would be more efficient, not more fragile." Another consultant stepped forward quickly, attempting to clarify. "Efficiency is increasing in isolated modules, but cross-system dependency mapping is still incomplete because we do not fully understand the original structure." Ethan Walker implemented. The room fell quiet again at the mention of his name, not because it was unfamiliar, but because it now carried measurable consequences. Charlotte stepped away from the table and approached the main display screen where system pathways were visualized in real time. She studied the network closely for the first time, noticing how many connections still referenced invisible dependencies that were never documented or transferred. She spoke quietly, almost to herself. "He built something that was not supposed to be visible." Daniel Reed, who had been observing remotely through a video link, interjected carefully. "Charlotte, this is exactly what I warned about. He was never just maintaining systems, he was holding them together in ways that were never written down." Charlotte closed her eyes briefly before opening them again and asking, "Where is he now?" The question was directed at no one in particular, but it carried urgency. One of the assistants checked quickly and responded, "He has not been active on any internal network since termination protocol was executed. He is completely offline from our system." Charlotte turned back to the screens as another critical alert appeared, this time affecting financial transaction routing across 3 departments. Simultaneously, the consulting team began discussing emergency rollback procedures, but it was already clear that the original architecture they had removed was not something that could simply be reversed without consequence. Charlotte finally spoke again, her voice lower now. "We did not replace him, we removed the foundation." The words settled across the room with uncomfortable clarity as the reality of the situation became undeniable. System stability was not improving, it was fragmenting in structured patterns that suggested deep dependency on a person no one had fully understood. And for the first time, Charlotte Hayes realized that expertise without comprehension had not elevated her company, it had destabilized it. And the absence of Ethan Walker was no longer theoretical, it was actively rewriting the entire structure in real time. The emergency operations room inside Hayes Global Technologies had now transformed into a controlled crisis environment where every screen displayed cascading instability rather than the structured efficiency the company had prided itself on only a short time earlier. Charlotte Hayes stood at the center of it all, her posture still firm, but her expression now carrying visible strain as she observed the consulting team attempting to stabilize systems that continued to fail and synchronized patterns across multiple departments. Alerts were no longer isolated, they were occurring in coordinated waves, suggesting that the underlying architecture was reacting to absence rather than malfunction. One senior engineer approached cautiously and reported that multiple back-end systems were now entering fallback loops because they could not locate expected coordination signals. Charlotte immediately responded, asking where those signals were supposed to originate. The engineer hesitated before answering. They were part of Ethan Walker's structural layer, but they were never formally documented, only embedded. Charlotte turned away, slowly processing the implication that critical components of her company's infrastructure had been intentionally or unintentionally designed to operate without visible instruction. The consulting lead stepped forward, attempting to maintain authority, and said, "We can isolate each failure point individually, but it will take time." Charlotte interrupted sharply. "How much time?" The consultant paused before responding. "Days, possibly longer, if we continue without understanding the original framework." Daniel Reed, who was still connected remotely, leaned forward into his camera feed and spoke with controlled urgency. Charlotte, this is not a typical system migration. What you removed was not a module. It was a behavioral logic layer that adjusted in real time to operational stress patterns. The room went silent again as that explanation reframed everything. Charlotte walked toward the central display where global operations were now visibly fragmented across multiple regions. She watched as communication nodes flickered in and out of alignment, like a network losing its sense of direction. She asked quietly, if Ethan Walker built this system, why is there no documentation? The lead engineer answered carefully, because he never operated in conventional documentation environments. He built through live adaptation, meaning the system was shaped by execution rather than instruction. Charlotte closed her eyes briefly before reopening them, as another failure alert appeared, this time affecting financial reconciliation processes across international branches. The consulting team began discussing emergency rollback procedures, but even they now sounded uncertain because rollback required a baseline structure that no longer existed in a usable form. Charlotte finally spoke again, her voice lower, but more focused than before. Find him. Daniel responded immediately. We have already attempted all available channels. He has no active presence in corporate systems or known communication pathways. It is as if he intentionally designed himself to be non-dependent. Charlotte turned slightly toward that statement as if recognizing something deeper hidden inside it. The idea was no longer simply that Ethan Walker had been removed, it was that he had designed his own absence to be structurally irrelevant. Yet paradoxically, the system now proved the opposite, as dependency, without visibility, was revealing itself in real time across every level of the organization. Another engineer stepped forward and said softly, the system is not breaking randomly, it is losing synchronization points that only he used to stabilize. Charlotte stared at the screens as entire operational regions began to desync simultaneously across continents, and for the first time since the decision had been made, she understood that replacing expertise had not modernized the company, it had exposed it, and what remained was not a stronger system, but a collapsing structure, revealing how deeply it had always relied on the quiet presence of one man who had never needed recognition to hold everything together. The crisis inside Hayes Global Technologies had escalated beyond isolated system failures and now resembled a full structural breakdown unfolding in real time across every operational layer of the company. Charlotte Hayes stood motionless at the center of the command floor as new alerts continued to flood every screen in synchronized waves, showing that entire divisions were now operating without alignment or communication. Her consulting team was no longer presenting solutions with confidence. Instead, they were rapidly attempting isolated emergency interventions that only seemed to slow the collapse rather than stop it. One senior analyst reported that financial routing between international branches had completely lost synchronization, and transactions were now being delayed or duplicated unpredictably. Charlotte asked in a controlled but visibly strained voice, how could this happen simultaneously across all regions? The analyst responded carefully, because all regions were previously unified through a shared structural coordination system that no longer exists in the current architecture. Daniel Reed, who had rejoined the conversation remotely, leaned forward and spoke with quiet urgency. Charlotte, you need to understand, this is not system degradation. This is structural dependency failure. Everything Ethan Walker maintained was not designed to be visible, but it was essential. Charlotte turned slightly toward the screen, showing cascading failures across North American and European operations, her voice lower. Now, then why did no one detect this dependency before? The consulting lead answered, because it was never labeled as dependency, it was embedded as adaptive logic, meaning the system learned from him continuously without documenting his input explicitly. The room grew quieter as that realization settled across the team. Another engineer stepped forward, holding a tablet displaying a visualization of network flow patterns, and pointed out that since Ethan Walker's removal, the system was no longer adjusting to irregular load distribution, causing instability to amplify instead of self-correcting. Charlotte stared at the visualization as multiple red indicators expanded across the global map, like spreading fractures. She asked slowly, is there any part of the system still stable? The consulting lead hesitated before replying, only isolated modules that do not rely on cross-coordination, but those modules Cannot support full operations independently. Daniel's voice came again through the speaker. With a more serious tone, Charlotte, you replaced a living adaptive structure with static expertise, and now the system is revealing what it always depended on. Charlotte stepped away from the central console and walked toward the glass wall overlooking the city below, as if distance could provide clarity, but the crisis followed her visually through reflections of collapsing data streams displayed across monitors behind her. She spoke quietly, almost to herself. Ethan never documented anything because he never needed to prove his presence, but now we are seeing what absence looks like in real time. Back at the console, alarms intensified as payment systems froze and internal communication channels began dropping simultaneously across continents. The consulting team attempted another coordinated restart, but quickly realized that restart protocols themselves were dependent on the same underlying structure that was now missing. One engineer admitted reluctantly, "Without Walker's coordination layer, we are essentially restarting." Blind Charlotte closed her eyes briefly, and when she opened them, her expression had shifted from denial toward recognition. She returned to the table and asked directly, "What happens if we cannot restore this structure?" The room fell silent before Daniel answered gently, "Then the company continues to fragment until independent systems stabilize at a lower capacity, but it will never operate at the level it once did." Charlotte absorbed the answer as another wave of system alerts confirmed further degradation across supply chain, logistics, and customer-facing platforms. She finally spoke with a calmness that no longer carried confidence, only understanding. "Then we did not improve the system," Daniel replied quietly. "No, we removed the reason it functioned." And in that moment, the full weight of her decision settled across the entire executive room as Hayes Global Technologies continued to unravel, not because of external attack or market failure, but because the invisible foundation holding everything together had been quietly removed without anyone understanding what it truly was. The crisis at Hayes Global Technologies had now entered a phase where instability was no longer isolated to systems, but had begun affecting the operational rhythm of the entire organization. Charlotte Hayes stood in the executive command room, surrounded by screens that displayed continuous synchronization failures across finance, logistics, communication, and client systems, all updating in real time with increasingly unpredictable patterns. The consulting team that had once spoken with confidence was now operating in fragmented coordination, attempting emergency corrections that only temporarily delayed further degradation. One senior systems analyst reported that core data routing between global offices had reached a critical failure state, meaning that even basic interdepartmental communication was now unreliable. Charlotte listened with a rigid expression before asking how long until partial recovery could be achieved. The analyst hesitated before responding that recovery was no longer a question of time, but of missing structural logic. Daniel Reed, who remained connected remotely, leaned forward and spoke with controlled seriousness. "Charlotte, you are witnessing what happens when a system loses its adaptive core. Everything you replaced Ethan Walker with operates on instructions, but he operated on continuity." Charlotte turned slightly toward the main display as another wave of alerts spread across European and North American nodes. Financial systems were now showing delayed settlements, cascading into reporting discrepancies that were affecting executive-level decision-making. She asked quietly if any portion of the system was still functioning independently. The consulting lead answered yes, but only isolated components that do not require cross-system coordination. Those components, however, cannot sustain enterprise-scale operations. Daniel added carefully, "The issue is not that the system is broken, it is that it no longer knows how to maintain balance across its own structure." Charlotte walked slowly across the room as she reviewed live data streams that now resembled disconnected fragments rather than a unified system. Her voice lowered. "Then what exactly was Ethan Walker doing that we did not understand?" A second senior engineer responded, "He was continuously adjusting system load distribution in real time, but those adjustments were never recorded as formal processes. They existed as adaptive responses learned through operational continuity." Charlotte stopped walking and turned back toward the screens as the implication became unavoidable. The system had never been fully static under Ethan Walker. It had been continuously self-stabilizing through mechanisms no one else had documented or even recognized as essential. Daniel spoke again with calm certainty. "Charlotte, this is why the system felt effortless when he was present, because it was never truly operating. Without him just operating through him, the consulting team attempted another diagnostic sweep, but results showed increasing fragmentation across all major operational sectors, indicating that system restoration efforts were now colliding with missing foundational logic rather than correcting it. One engineer admitted quietly that every attempt to rebuild the architecture was only revealing deeper dependencies that could not be replicated without original behavioral logic patterns. Charlotte closed her eyes briefly as the full realization began to settle across her, understanding that the decision she had made was not a simple personnel change, but a removal of an invisible coordination framework that had been sustaining the entire organization. She finally asked in a steady but quieter tone, "What is our current operational status?" The consulting lead responded honestly, "We are functioning at reduced capacity and continuing to degrade in efficiency as synchronization loss expands." Daniel added gently, "This is not collapse caused by external pressure, it is internal structural loss." The room fell into a deep silence as the executive team collectively recognized that what they had interpreted as replaceable expertise had actually been a hidden stabilizing force that no one had ever measured or understood. And as Hayes Global Technologies continued to fragment in real time, Charlotte Hayes stood in the center of the command floor, fully aware that the absence of Ethan Walker was no longer a theoretical consequence, but a visible reality reshaping everything she had once believed to be under control. The operational floor of Hayes Global Technologies had now reached a state where every new update on the system dashboards felt less like a correction and more like a confirmation of decline. Charlotte Hayes stood at the center of the executive command room, surrounded by fragmented screens, displaying partial outages across global divisions that were no longer following any predictable pattern. The consulting team had reduced their communication to short, urgent exchanges as they attempted to stabilize isolated components without triggering further disruptions. One senior analyst reported that intercontinental synchronization had failed completely, meaning that regional systems were now functioning independently, without shared coordination logic. Charlotte listened in silence before asking what that means for enterprise-level operations. The analyst responded carefully, "It means each region is now operating on its own interpretation of system rules without unified control." Daniel Reed, who was still connected remotely, leaned closer to his microphone and spoke with measured seriousness. "Charlotte, this is what happens when the coordinating intelligence is removed. The system does not shut down, it fractures into self-contained segments that cannot communicate effectively." Charlotte turned her attention back to the main display, where global network maps were now showing increasing separation between operational clusters. Financial systems in North America were no longer aligning with European reporting cycles, and Asia-Pacific divisions were generating conflicting data outputs that could no longer be reconciled in real time. She asked quietly, "Is there any mechanism left that can restore alignment?" The consulting lead answered reluctantly, "Only if we can reconstruct the original adaptive layer, but we do not have enough information to rebuild it accurately." Daniel added, "That is because Ethan Walker never left behind a blueprint. He left behind behavior-based continuity, which cannot be replicated through static instruction." Charlotte stepped away from the console and walked slowly toward the glass wall overlooking the city below, as if distance could help her process the scale of what was happening behind her. Alarms continued to escalate, but the sound now felt distant, almost secondary to the realization forming in her mind. She spoke without turning back, "So you are telling me the entire company was dependent on something we never documented?" One of the senior engineers responded, "Yes, but it was not dependency in the traditional sense. It was continuous adaptation that made dependency invisible." Charlotte closed her eyes briefly as the implications settled deeper across the executive room. Every decision she had made to replace Ethan Walker had been based on the assumption that systems could function independently of the person who had shaped their stability. Daniel's voice returned calm but firm. "Charlotte, this is why the collapse feels structured. It is not random failure, it is the absence of adaptive logic removing itself from every process at once." Supported the consulting team attempted one final coordinated recovery sequence, but within minutes it became clear that the system architecture was no longer responding to external correction because the internal framework that allowed correction to exist had already dissolved. One analyst admitted quietly, "We are not repairing a broken system, we are trying to operate one that no longer recognizes itself." Charlotte returned to the center of the room and looked across every screen, now displaying fragmented operational states across all regions, and for the first time her voice carried no authority, only realization. What happens if we continue without him? Daniel answered gently. Then the system stabilizes at a much lower capacity, but it will never return to its previous level of integration. The silence that followed was heavier than any alarm, as every executive in the room understood the irreversible nature of what had already occurred. Hayes Global Technologies was still functioning, but no longer as a unified system, and Charlotte Hayes stood at its center, fully aware that the absence of one silent single father had reshaped the entire structure beyond repair. The executive command floor at Hayes Global Technologies had now entered a state of controlled instability, where every system update felt like a confirmation that the organization was no longer operating as a single unified structure. Charlotte Hayes stood motionless at the center of the room, surrounded by fragmented displays showing regional divisions operating in isolation, without synchronization or shared coordination logic. The consulting team had shifted from strategic correction to emergency containment as they attempted to stabilize individual modules without triggering further cascading disruptions. One senior engineer reported that interregional communication channels were now completely unreliable, and financial reporting cycles were no longer aligning across any global branch. Charlotte listened carefully before asking, "What is currently holding anything together?" The engineer hesitated before responding, "Nothing is actively holding it together anymore. Each region is operating based on residual patterns that remain from the previous structure." Daniel Reed, who was still connected remotely, leaned forward with a calm but serious expression. "Charlotte, this is no longer about fixing a system. It is about understanding that the system you had was never static. It was continuously maintained by Ethan Walker in real-time adaptation." Charlotte turned slightly toward the main display as another wave of alerts appeared across global nodes, now showing deeper fragmentation in operational logic. Supply chain coordination had broken into independent cycles, and customer-facing platforms were generating inconsistent outputs that could not be reconciled into a unified report. She asked quietly, "Is there any part of the system still functioning as intended?" The consulting lead answered, "Only isolated components that do not require interaction with other systems, but those components cannot support enterprise-level operation." Daniel added carefully, "What you are seeing is the natural outcome of removing adaptive continuity from a living system." Charlotte stepped away from the console and walked slowly toward the glass wall overlooking the city. As she spoke in a lower voice, "Then what exactly did Ethan Walker do that no one else could replicate?" One senior systems architect responded, "He maintained dynamic equilibrium across all operational layers, but he did it through real-time behavioral adjustments rather than fixed protocols, meaning his influence was never stored, only executed continuously." Charlotte closed her eyes briefly as she absorbed the realization that what she had dismissed as replaceable labor had in fact been an invisible stabilizing mechanism embedded across every layer of the company. Daniel spoke again, his tone steady. "Charlotte, this is why everything is failing in a structured way. It is not chaos. It is the absence of adaptive intelligence that once regulated complexity." The consulting team attempted another full-scale system recovery, but within minutes it became clear that no restoration process could function without the missing coordination framework itself. One engineer admitted quietly, "We are trying to rebuild something that only worked because it was constantly being shaped by someone who is no longer here." Charlotte returned to the center of the command floor and looked across every screen, now displaying fragmented global operations, and for the first time her voice carried no directive authority, only realization. "What are our options? If we cannot restore him," Daniel answered gently, "then the company continues operating at reduced capacity, but it will never regain integrated functionality." The silence that followed was absolute as executives across the room understood that the decision made earlier had not simply removed a person, but had dismantled the invisible architecture that had been sustaining every part of the organization. And Charlotte Hayes stood at the center of that realization, fully aware that Hayes Global Technologies was no longer collapsing from external pressure, but from the absence of the one man who had quietly held its entire structure together without ever asking to be seen. The crisis at Hayes Global Technologies had now reached a point where every system display across the executive command floor reflected not just failure, but structured Fragmentation, as if the entire organization had begun reorganizing itself into smaller independent units. Without any central control, Charlotte Hayes stood at the center of this collapse, surrounded by consultants and engineers who were now working in fragmented coordination, attempting to preserve isolated functions rather than restore full system integrity. Each passing minute introduced new instability across global operations, including finance, logistics, and internal communication networks. Daniel Reed, who remained connected remotely, spoke with a calm but serious tone. Charlotte, what you are seeing now is the final stage of structural dependency breakdown. The system is no longer responding as a whole because the coordinating layer is completely gone. Charlotte turned toward the main display, where global operational maps showed entire regions functioning in isolation without any synchronization between them. She asked quietly, "Then what is still working?" The lead systems engineer responded, "Only standalone modules that do not rely on cross-communication, but they cannot sustain enterprise-scale output." Daniel added carefully, "This is what happens when a system that was built on adaptive intelligence loses its adaptive core." Charlotte slowly walked across the room, her eyes scanning rows of disconnected data streams before asking with a quieter voice, "Is there any way to rebuild what was lost?" The consulting lead hesitated before answering, "Only if we can fully reconstruct Ethan Walker's adaptive logic layer, but that was never documented. It was continuously executed and self-evolving." Charlotte stopped moving as that explanation settled across her understanding. One of the senior engineers stepped forward and said respectfully, "Everything he did was based on real-time adjustments to system behavior patterns. Nothing he maintained was static. It was all relational intelligence that adapted instantly to stress conditions across the network." Daniel's voice came again through the remote connection, "Charlotte, you did not replace a person. You removed the mechanism that allowed everything else to function in harmony." The room fell into deeper silence as executives began to realize the full implication of what had been lost. Another engineer reported that financial systems were now operating at reduced capacity across all regions, with increasing delays in reconciliation processes and growing inconsistencies in reporting accuracy. Charlotte looked at the screens showing cascading failures and asked in a controlled but quieter tone, "What happens if we continue operating without him?" Daniel responded gently, "Then the system will stabilize at a much lower threshold, but it will never return to its previous level of integration." Charlotte turned slightly toward the glass wall overlooking the city as she spoke almost to herself, "Then we have permanently reduced the company's capability without understanding what we removed." The consulting team confirmed quietly, "Yes, that is exactly what has occurred." The silence that followed was heavier than any previous alarm because every executive in the room now understood that Hayes Global Technologies was not experiencing temporary disruption, but irreversible structural degradation caused by the absence of one silent operational core that had never been properly understood. And as Charlotte Hayes stood in the center of that realization, she finally acknowledged that the collapse unfolding around her was not a failure of technology, but a failure of perception. The executive command floor of Hayes Global Technologies had fallen into a state of quiet instability where no new alerts were being treated as isolated incidents, because every system update now represented another layer of structural fragmentation. Charlotte Hayes stood at the center of the room, surrounded by screens that once displayed synchronized global operations, but were now showing disconnected regional systems operating independently without any unified coordination. Daniel Reed remained connected remotely, his voice calm but firm as he observed the final stage of the collapse. "Charlotte, what you are witnessing is not temporary failure. It is the permanent loss of the system's adaptive foundation." Charlotte did not respond immediately. Her eyes remained fixed on the main display, where financial networks, communication channels, and operational dashboards were now functioning as separate entities without any shared logic. She finally spoke in a low, steady tone, "Is there anything left that resembles the original system?" One of the lead engineers answered carefully, "Only fragments, but they are no longer capable of supporting enterprise-level integration." Daniel added, "Charlotte, this is the consequence of removing a system that was never documented because it was never static. It was continuously alive in its behavior." Charlotte turned slowly toward him through the remote connection. "Then what happens now?" Daniel paused before answering. "The company continues, but not as a unified structure. It will operate at reduced capacity indefinitely." Charlotte walked toward the glass wall overlooking the city below as she processed the weight of what that meant. Every decision she had made to modernize the organization had been based on the belief that systems could be separated from the individuals who maintained them. But what she was seeing now contradicted that assumption entirely. Behind her, the consulting team attempted one final analysis, confirming that no reconstruction was possible without recreating the original adaptive logic layer that had once been maintained by Ethan Walker. One engineer spoke quietly. Everything he did was reactive, continuous, and unrecorded. The system did not just depend on him, it learned through him. Daniel's voice returned softer now. Charlotte, you did not lose a resource, you removed the only thing that allowed complexity to remain stable across scale. The room fell into silence as executives began to understand that the collapse was not accelerating because of malfunction, but because every remaining component was now revealing its dependency on something that no longer existed. Charlotte finally spoke again, her voice stripped of its earlier certainty. What would it take to restore what we had? Daniel answered honestly, we would need him, or something capable of replicating continuous adaptive intelligence across every layer of the organization. Charlotte closed her eyes briefly as that answer settled, because for the first time she understood that what she had dismissed as replaceable labor had actually been the invisible architecture holding the entire company together. Without recognition, without documentation, and without permission, the consulting lead confirmed quietly, at this point recovery is no longer about optimization, it is about restoration of a system that was never designed to function without its core. The final alerts across the screen slowed, but not because stability had returned, instead because the system itself had reached a new lower equilibrium where everything that remained was functional but permanently diminished. Charlotte stood in silence at the center of the command floor, realizing that Hayes Global Technologies had not simply lost an employee, it had lost the unseen intelligence that made its scale possible. And as the city lights glowed beyond the glass wall, she understood that some absences do not create gaps, they redefine everything that comes after them. Thank you for watching until the end of this video. We truly appreciate your time and support. Please share your thoughts in the comments section below and let us know how you felt about this story. Do not forget to subscribe to our channel for more emotional and powerful stories like this. We look forward to seeing you in the next video.